Right, I think we will get started so that we can all leave on time as well. Good evening to all those of you joining us. My name is Dr. Trevelyan Wing. I'm a Baltic Fellow here at the University of Cambridge's Centre for Geopolitics, and I'm delighted to welcome you virtually to Cambridge for this very timely discussion entitled, rather appropriately, if dramatically, The Grey Zone War Beneath the Seas, Protecting Critical Undersea Infrastructure from Mounting Threats in European Waters. Today, gray zone, as opposed to kinetic conflict, is a mounting concern for governments around the world, not least in Europe. Attacks on critical undersea infrastructure present a particular threat, not least to the UK, again, which is, of course, especially vulnerable here given its geography. Such infrastructure is the lifeblood of modern societies, facilitating international connectivity, business, and powering whole economies, and ensuring their energy security. Today, these networks are being targeted at an increasing rate, with a growing number of alarming incidents reported in European waters since 2022 in particular. In December 2024, for example, the failure of the Estlink 2 submarine power cable between Estonia and Finland collapsed cross-border capacity, with the damage attributed to the Russian oil tanker Eagle S, itself part of Russia's so-called shadow fleet. Just over a year prior, the nearby Finnish-Estonian subsea Balticconnector gas pipeline was also ruptured, this time by the new Polar Bear, a Hong Kong-flagged Chinese vessel. The September 2022 sabotage of the Nord Stream gas pipelines is another infamous example, of course. And these are just a scattering of the many other incidents that have occurred. All represent stark warnings for governments and societies today. So what then is the precise nature of contemporary gray zone threats in this vital arena? How are nations responding to the hybrid dangers they pose? And to what extent can this critical infrastructure in fact be protected from malicious activity and attack at sea? Joining me to explore these questions and more are two distinguished experts, Commodore Andy James, Deputy Director within the Defense Nuclear Organization, with over 25 years experience in the Royal Navy and Reserves, and Dr. John Ash, a former submariner and oceanographer with the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force fighter control officer, and associate of the University of Cambridge's Scott Polar Research Institute. One quick note before we dive in. If you have any questions, please do drop them in the Q&A chat, and we will be picking those up as we go later on in the discussion. Without further ado, it's my great privilege and indeed pleasure to first welcome Commodore Andy James to the floor. Commodore James currently, as mentioned, serves as a Deputy Director within the Defense Nuclear Organization in London. He has over, again, 25 years experience in the reserves in the Royal Navy, so we're especially grateful to have him here to share that experience with us. His early career was focused on seagoing roles in operational submarines deployed right around the world. Since then, Commodore James has served on the staff at Britannia Royal Naval College and in headquarters roles, including at US Central Command, twice in Navy Command Headquarters, and UK Strategic Command, and now in 3 different roles in the Ministry of Defence. He holds an undergraduate degree in engineering from Edinburgh University and postgraduate qualifications, including a master's in international security from Massey University, New Zealand, and an MBA from Cranfield University. Commodore James is a chartered engineer and fellow of the Institute of Marine Engineering, Science, and Technology, and was a first Sea Lord Fellow from 2022 to 2024. Commodore James, you have the floor. Welcome.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. And many thanks for the invitation to speak and contribute today. I think for those of us who I describe as being in practice as opposed to in academia, I think it's really invaluable for us to have the opportunity to share some thoughts, to listen to others, to have some of our own thinking challenged in forums like this. And I think it's a really valuable opportunity. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me back. I should probably open also by just explaining that despite that those kind words in my introduction, I'm very much here speaking on behalf of myself. I'm not sort of formally representing either the Royal Navy or the Ministry of Defence, and the views that I express here are mine. I'm very happy to be challenged on those, but as I say, I'm very much here in my own capacity rather than as a representative of the Royal Navy. as Trevelyan's opening comments have observed, I mean, I think a really important topic that we're examining this afternoon, getting increasing focus in the mainstream. This is not now a niche subject for specialists, but very much in the forefront of people's thinking in the sort of popular narrative and mainstream narrative. I'm minded to observe comments made both by the UK's previous Secretary of State for Defence and by the current Chief of Defence Staff on this topic in the last 12 months or so, both quite pointed, I think, and quite focused in terms of both their observation on the challenges that we all face, but also where the threat lies. So, as I say, this is a topic that's getting increasing focus and really valuable opportunity to speak about it today. But it probably is only in recent years that we've really started to dig into this in topic with quite the interest that I think we see today. And I'll discuss perhaps a little bit later on in my opening remarks that we in NATO, I think, have been a bit slow to pick up on the early warning signs of the threat here, and I think there's a bit of catching up collectively that we've got to do, both in terms of our own capabilities, but also our level of thinking on this topic. I'm going to focus my opening comments on two whys, but underpinning both, and I think at the heart of much of what I want to observe, it is an assertion, a hypothesis maybe, an assertion maybe, that if you want to hide something, you want to hide what you're doing, you want to hide your activities, who you are and what you're up to, doing it underwater remains a really good place to do it. And whilst there are occasionally sort of tabloid-esque commentaries about the transparent ocean and the ease with which your operators can understand what's going on under the water, I think I will start from the assertion that it is still extremely difficult to get a really clear picture of all the activity that's going on underwater, and is therefore a particularly good place to hide what you're up to, where you are, and your intent. A lot of that point is underpinned by technology, and so it might be tempting to suggest that there's a sort of technological asymmetry here, or that one half of that sort of technological cycle is in predominance. But I think as many observers on military technology, John Boyd or Martin van Creveld and others, would caution that looking at that cyclical nature of technology development. So this is not a one-sided view of who has the upper hand, but just an observation on where some of the challenges today might lie. Right, the two whys I wanted to look at then. The first is why is our underwater critical national infrastructure so apparently vulnerable? And the second is why do we view Russia as such a potent threat in this area? And I've quite quickly put my cards on the table there about where I see that threat coming from. That's not to exclude other actors, both state and non-state actors, but I think much of the thinking here probably revolves around Russia as the exemplar of the threat, if nothing else. So first, why so vulnerable? I might start slightly counterintuitively by saying probably not more so than land-based CNI, and certainly there's plenty of thinking around the challenges that our critical national infrastructure on land might face in terms of their vulnerabilities, whether that be transport, energy, communications infrastructure ashore. There's certainly an element of that vulnerability ashore being reflected into the underwater environment. So in some respects, there's nothing, for me, there's nothing particularly unique there. Targeting and exploiting that vulnerability is at least as valid ashore as it is under the water. The problem we have with undersea critical national infrastructure, and as Trevelyan's already opened, obviously energy, communications, some physical infrastructure as well, is really centered around what I think that the core of this seminar looks at, which is this idea of the grey zone. the ability for action against that infrastructure, whether that's simply surveillance or whether it's direct disruption, the ability for that action to be obscured, to be deniable, to be perhaps conflated with otherwise legitimate action going on. That legitimate action might be accidents. There's plenty of evidence of underwater infrastructure being affected by accidents, but also a perfectly reasonable routine activity, whether that might be survey activity or routine ship activity in waters which might well include international waters. And so it's that element of the grey zone which particularly plays out for me in the underwater CNI that has a marked difference for me from the land-based vulnerabilities that critical national infrastructure might be exposed to. So it is the ease of hiding, going back to that point about being able to hide, being able to inflict real economic pain on an adversary by targeting that underwater critical national infrastructure in an action that is unlikely to produce an immediate direct response because it's obscured, because it's deniable, because it might be conflated with innocent cause, that is at the heart of why our underwater CNI is particularly vulnerable. It's that grey zone opportunity that presents itself. So that's the first why. But it's not easy to target. This is not an easy thing to target underwater CNI. I mean, it takes real competence, including technical competence, to do it. And so, as I say, whilst there are a range of actors that could do it, including non-state actors, and we certainly see some evidence of that globally, we are, I think, inevitably going to focus on Russia because they have both the intent. And as discussed there, the intent as part of a hybrid doctrine and the capability. And it's this capability, their development of underwater capability to target underwater CNI that has been in development for decades and focused particularly on a part of their defence, the main Directorate for Deep Sea Research. That marks them out as a particular threat, and why Russia? It's because of their long-standing capability development in this area for me. What do they pose? Well, ships, both crewed and uncrewed undersea vehicles, all developed by a cadre of specialists looking and particularly focused on this area of activity. And recall, whilst much of Russia's military capability has been under real pressure born from the war in Ukraine, their investment in this area, and indeed in their wider submarine capability, continues pretty much unaffected. And so, as a mark of their own interest and focus in this particular area of capability, I think that's quite telling. It does take real capability development to pose a threat, particularly in a variety of depths of water and against a variety of particular targets. This is not something that is easily developed or quickly developed. What is perhaps unfortunate for the West and for Europe is that Russia, as I say, has been at this for some time, some years, and has continued to make that investment. And it's for that reason that they pose the particular challenge, the particular threat today. So those are two little why statements, I think, both underpinned by that the value of being able to hide in the underwater. I think I'll close my opening comments by just talking a little bit, perhaps just opening the conversation about what can we do in response, where can we go in terms of our actions to counter some of these challenges. Some very quick thoughts, and we're happy to sort of open it up in question and answer or commentary later. So first, recognizing the problem, recognizing that this is a real challenge to Europe now. This is not something that we can continue to admire but do little about. We have got some catching up to do, I think, frankly, across Europe, across NATO. and now is the time to do it. I think even conversations such as this and bringing in that sort of wider sense of expertise and thought leadership on topics like this is really helpful. So as I alluded to earlier, I think the fact that is becoming more mainstream in the sort of mainstream narrative on this topic is an indication of that problem being recognised, but still plenty to do. Next, invest in our own capabilities. Civilian to a certain extent, military certainly. To what effect? To deter fundamentally, and where necessary to counter that threat. And really the first element of that effective deterrence is to improve our ability to detect, to shift that balance in terms of the ease with which an actor can hide in the underwater space. And that helps build up a more even, more contested opportunity for us to challenge. 3, to work as a collective. I've mentioned NATO a couple of times already, and I think that's an obvious. It doesn't have to be through NATO. There are a number of other sort of multilateral mechanisms that will have an interest here and may well bring something valuable. This is almost by definition. This is a multinational problem, and for me, that kind of argues for multinational solution. We're already seeing some useful traction through NATO, the establishment of the Critical Undersea Infrastructure Coordination Cell, and sister organisations based at the NATO's Maritime Command, just down the road from me here in Northwood. But early days, I think it's fair to say, on much of that. And last, I think we need to start to shift that understanding of undersea CNI and the resilience that we need to build into it in the same terms as we do for our land-based CNI. An understanding of how we build in, create the resilience that will undoubtedly protect us in the event that the threat manifests itself, I think will be a really important step. We again see conversations around the importance of resilience and our land-based CNI becoming more mainstream, and I think that needs to extend to the underwater as well. So I'm going to wrap up there for my opening remarks. Just to summarise, the importance of the ease with which you can hide in the underwater space. The 2 whys: why are we vulnerable? Because it's grey zone. Why Russia? Because they've invested in their capabilities for some time. There's quite a deal of catching up for us to do. And then lastly, some very quick thoughts on where we might go in terms of rebalancing some of that challenge. Trillian, I'll end there and hand back to you.
Great, Andy, thank you very much for that excellent contribution. I think it really frames this topic and the hopefully ensuing conversation we will have both between us and with the audience brilliantly. So again, thank you very much for that. Next, it's my real pleasure again to welcome our second speaker for today, Dr. John Ash. Dr. Ash is a former Royal Air Force fighter control officer who spent the latter part of his service career in the Royal Navy. There, as an oceanographer and submariner, he was involved in the collection of data in the Arctic Ocean to support the study of thinning in the polar ice pack. Selected to lead a team of Russian researchers examining radionuclide pollution in the northern seas, he was later assigned to undertake the initial design work for the Navy Department's environmental management system. Dr. Ash has held a British Safety Council Fellowship at the Judge Institute of Management Studies at the University of Cambridge, just down the road actually, where the focus of his research was on the management of dynamic risk problems in operational environments. An associate of the Scott Polar Research Institute, also down the road, he also holds a professional qualification in environmental risk management and has lectured on risk management in operational environments at the Royal Air Force College, Cranwell, and the Defence Academy of the UK. His Arctic-related projects include the provision of defence policy advice to the UK Parliament and collaboration in a defence scenario exercise with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, i.e. Chatham House. Dr. Ash, we are very delighted to have you here with us and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Trevelyan, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to address my remarks this evening to how to solve the problems that we see so ably described, both in the media and here this evening. The solution that I will describe rests on three axes. The first is jurisdiction, the second is detection, and the third is intervention. Now, it is actually relatively easy to damage and conceal the fact that you are damaging undersea cables. The damage might be inflicted as simply as dragging an anchor across the cables. And I should say in this regard that practically every heavy merchantman has the capacity to do that, because they'll be equipped with at least 10 shackles worth of anchor chain, which means that they have something like 275 meters worth of reach. They can access anything on the continental shelf, and they can do so while appearing to do so accidentally. If you want something more professional, you can either use directed explosives clamped on to a cable or detonated in the vicinity if the cable is buried. For some specialist use, for hydraulic cutting, that's possible. And the Chinese now advertising a cable cutting device, which will operate down to 4,000 meters, using a diamond encrusted wheel that requires only a kilowatt to operate it. So it could be operated from a submersible. So there are plenty of ways in which you can damage a cable. In terms of the capability to restore or protect the system, understand, of course, that the traffic that these cables are carrying, to some extent, are self-protected in as much as for the web, we're dealing with data packets. So there is some kind of resilience within the system itself. One of the things you might be able to do, for example, in protecting yourself, is to order the priority or reorder the priority of the data packet. So certain traffic has priority. If you lose capacity, you might be able to address or mitigate the attack in that way. You may also have some redundant capacity. Some nations may be able to afford dedicated military lines, but I should comment in this regard that the data requirements of a defense system are extreme. The United States Department of Defense sends something like 95% of its data via cables, and that can include real-time intelligence information and control of drones. So you can see that the demand for information capacity is high, and damaging it would eventually cause serious problems. In this regard, I'll just finish this section of what I'm saying by putting one thing which I have not seen advertised or spoken of publicly, although it's a fairly obvious thing, it's intuitively obvious. And that is one of the questions that comes out in discussions of nuclear combat is who you're going to call. That is to say, if you do too much damage to an enemy, there might be no one left to phone and negotiate with. The problem in this case, if you do too much damage to the infrastructure, is how are you going to call? In which case that critical communications might suddenly evaporate. But I mentioned that there are three things which are necessary if we are really going to address this issue. And I'll conclude my remarks later by providing a brief roadmap as to how to go about this. The first is jurisdiction. I should say in this regard that the current law, the extant law with regard to the law of the sea, is worse than useless. It is actually obstructive. In particular, if you look at the 1884 Convention on the Protection of Submarine Telegraph Cables, it's not even clear that that applies to the modern type of data cable. In a sense, it's probably better that it doesn't and that we regard it as not doing so. These are not telegraph cables. These are fiber optic communication systems. And they carry a far greater weight of data than could ever have been carried in previous copper systems. The limitations on action in that legislation or in that convention, if you like, effectively prohibit useful action. That leaves us really with the law of the sea and Article 51, the right to self-defense under the United Nations Charter. Just about the only thing that provides universal jurisdiction, which is what you need to take action against grey zone actors, is Article 101, which deals with piracy. And the wording of that article allows you to treat behavior of this sort as piracy. That therefore provides universal jurisdiction. Now, there are a number of legal commentators who deny this, and they point to 113 and other areas which seem to suggest that you can only invite a flag state to intervene should you have a complaint about, for example, a surface ship damaging your cables. But I suspect there are alternative readings to that. In particular, if the issue is, in the case of Article 113, that the flag state should or is enjoined by UNCLOS to provide law that prohibits its vessels from causing these kinds of issues, then that legislation might indeed be a law against piracy. So there's no reason to assume automatically that we are prevented from using that law. And if we might take a lead from President Truman, who in 1945 made a declaration expanding United States jurisdiction over its continental shelf, that proved a leader in bringing about customary international law. I would strongly recommend that we raise at the UN, G20, and other fora the fact that we wish from now on to regard an attack, a grey zone attack, that is to say, on cables by non-state vessels as falling under that legislation, that we would respond accordingly. The other thing which we might do is act, if it's a state vessel, under Article 51. Now, if you look at the article, if you look at the wording of it, it seems to enjoin individuals to do, or nation states to do nothing whatsoever at all. In fact, there are ways in which you can use this legislation in order to protect the state. In particular, there is a right to self-defense, but an attack on a submarine cable would also constitute a violation of the norm of non-intervention against the sovereignty of another state. And therefore, for that reason, and also the fact that we would be taking action in consonance with the principles of the United Nations, you could act, and I would suggest that that's how we should be thinking about in conversation with our allies dealing with this problem. Having dealt with jurisdiction, and that's critically important, what then can we do in order to address this problem? Well, I mentioned that the two other issues apart from jurisdiction were detection and intervention. Now, in terms of detection, some of the cables are actually provided with acoustic systems, so you can actually identify that something is going on. You can certainly identify where a cable is broken. The real problem is if you are subject to two forms of attack, either multiple breaks on the same cable, so you don't know the precise position, you only know a zone within which it's been broken, or sudden attacks on a large number of cables, which is technically possible, that would deny you a great deal of bandwidth very quickly. So under those circumstances, you're left with observation on the cables, that is to say, monitoring the cables, also bringing in new observation from drones and other such facilities, and watching the sea surface to see who is actually deploying and are they behaving suspiciously. You might, for example, take as suspicious the fact that an AIS system on a merchant vessel is shut down just before there was a cable break, and act accordingly. And bear in mind that the kind of facilities that we can deploy, they are not just surface warships. We also have maritime patrol aircraft. We can deploy drones, and in my judgment, we should have more of them. But also, if we take a leaf out of the New Zealanders' book, they were prepared to defend their sea space against illegal fishing. In 1976, there was a classic case in which a Taiwanese squid jigger refused to stop when challenged. And what they did was they scrambled a fighter aircraft to stitch a line of cannon shells in front of it, at which point it stopped immediately. So there are a number of facilities that we might not normally conventionally think about using, including, for example, the quick reaction alert force that we have to defend our airspace, in order to ensure rapid prosecution of violators. And of course, it's the case that potential adversaries would retaliate, but seeing as most of our traffic moves by states, by vessels not flagged to us, it probably won't make a lot of difference. Intervention can be in various forms. For example, you can arrest a vessel with a radio call. And if they refuse to respond and turn to the port of your choice, you can then respond physically. So it's a question of how determined you are politically to protect your infrastructure. And if we take a lead, and other nations have already started in this respect, for example, Australia, and New Zealand have already passed legislation protecting their cable system, but only within their own territorial waters. What we need is broader jurisdiction and demonstrations of intent. I will make one further comment on the subject of landing stations because they're critically important infrastructure. In the southwest, there is a museum at Porthcurno, a cable station. Interesting historically, it's now a museum, but it represents some early technology of this sort. And you might be interested to know that during the Second World War, they deployed some 300 infantry to that location, together with anti-aircraft facilities and machine gun, to actually protect that station because they understood how valuable it would be. Equivalent nowadays, we would have better detection systems and we wouldn't require that level of infantry protection, but we would need to diversify our landing stations and we would need to protect them, and that will not be easy. But if I may close now with a statement of requirements, if you like, a roadmap of how we can get to where we need to be to protect these systems, it would be as follows. First of all, we need legislation to protect protected zones in our own territorial waters. We would need an international announcement at the United Nations and G20 of how we intend to interpret the law of the sea in the future. We would need an announcement in particular with regard to UNCLOS and Article 51. We would need to enhance our cable harm detection capabilities, in particular drones, but we might need to provide tax incentives to companies if they are going to lay cables that also incorporate acoustic detection systems. We would need to enforce piracy prosecutions for vessels behaving suspiciously. And finally, we would need to enhance the protection of cable landing stations because they are an easy way of attacking these systems. Those are my remarks, Trevelyan. Thank you very much indeed.
Brilliant. No, thank you. There's, again, a lot there for us to delve into. So I really appreciate laying that out as you did for us here. And we will get to audience questions soon. But I mean, I guess right off the bat, I mean, this is one of the, I mean, again, there's the sort of practical response in terms of how can we physically, I suppose, do more to ensure the security to the extent possible of this type of infrastructure. But again, you raised there and delved into here the legal aspect of things and how can we actually better apply our legal frameworks and indeed international legal frameworks to this. You mentioned UNCLOS, of course, a number of times there, of course, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, for those who aren't aware. How has the UK and indeed other partners, I mean, to what extent is work being done here between governments, especially here in Europe, on this front in terms of trying to push this cause forward? Because again, of course, this is only one piece of that broader, legal puzzle. But it is, of course, one of the key tools, perhaps legally, in this area. Perhaps I'll direct that first at John.
Well, I'm not aware of any initiative to actually change the law in that respect. Now, obviously, there's been to try and address other issues. There's been anti-terrorism legislation, but the supremacy of flag states' jurisdiction has always been sewn well into the UNCLOS framework. What we're looking at here is dealing with a threat so universal that it really harms potentially everybody, which is why piracy, it seems to me, is particularly the way to approach this problem. And once one state shows intent, I believe that others may well follow, because everyone basically could suffer under a sustained or intensive attack of this sort.
Very interesting. I have a follow-up to that, but I know, Andy, is there anything that you want to say? Again, crucially, the reason why I asked that question is because, as you just said, right, there really, as far as I'm aware, are not initiatives kind of underway in this particular area. That's why I found it especially intriguing that you spoke so much to UNCLOS and actually how these types of legal frameworks might be applied to the broader context. But again, that's sort of my legal interest coming out there. But Andy.
So likewise, I'm unaware, although in the interests of honesty, not my area particularly. This, I think two observations. Anyone who engages with issues around UNCLOS and maritime law will recognise it's a thorny area with plenty of challenges. So we mustn't underestimate the difficulty here. That's not to argue for lack of ambition, but just to be rooted in historical reality. And secondly, I'll sort of reiterate a point I made earlier about the very nature of much of what we're talking about is a multinational one. The sort of national-based response here. It is perhaps necessary and helpful, but is probably only a fairly thin starting point for what really does need to be a multinational view in my observation.
Yeah, I mean, I think again on that front, I was very struck when you. I mean, I think the way you put it before, multinational solutions to to a multinational problem. If we take the Baltic Sea as an example here, of course, I mean, I am a Baltic fellow here, so of course I spend a lot of time looking at that greater basin. We've seen, of course, a number of different types of international approaches dealing with a raft of different issues there. I mean, you have, of course, MEP on the EU side, etc. There's, of course, a security component of that. You have, of course, NATO, and of course with JEF2, kind of various exercises and other approaches. Of course, Marcom, in the context of the alliance, is obviously a vital actor there too. Do you see? I mean, especially if we look at the past few years, and we've seen these repeated incidents happening right across the Baltic, and I guess for to be clear, I mean, a number of different countries have been affected, including, I think, Russia. Of course, you had the Baltica cable, to Kaliningrad also being affected. But of course, the predominance here has been you've seen these cables connecting, for example, the Baltic states with the Nordics, etc. Of course, Nord Stream, famously, again, Russia or Russian-German pipeline. But there have been many more of these incidents since, in particular, 2022. There has certainly been attempts at addressing that. I mean, again, you see, with Marcom, you see exercises including the Baltic Protector, for example, and various other attempts by national governments working with, again, allies to do more in this area. But over the coming period, right, in light of the recent spate of incidents, I mean, what's your, what do you see, especially, I guess, let me direct this first at you, Andy. Do you see more being done here, not just building on the current existing initiatives, but have there been in your, from what you've seen in your position, real discussions, again, behind the scenes to do something maybe a bit more meaty here, if that isn't in fact possible?
I mean, the short answer is yes, I do. I do see that real intent to get after some of the challenge here. I think. I mean, first of all, you allude to the Baltic as as a number of examples that you've cited there, and I think if one had to sort of look at the geography issue, the Baltic is an obvious place to start. With a number of challenges there, but Northern Europe and the waters around the UK are also particularly important, and we mustn't forget the Mediterranean from a wider European perspective as well. I focus on the Baltic as a sort of exemplar, as a pathfinder for potential action is very sensible, but it will inevitably extends much further than that. In terms of the actors, I mean, we've touched on NATO variously, but you and I have touched on that, and that's partly because I think inevitably I'll view this through a security lens in particular. but it feels like the obvious multilateral actor here from a European perspective. But it's not the only one. Variously, there've been certainly dialogue and thought processes through the Joint Expeditionary Force, the JEF, for which the UK is the framework nation, and that organisation obviously sought to bring together a number of Baltic and Northern European nations, particularly prior to Sweden and Finland joining NATO. It was an opportunity for those two nations to become involved. So there's another potential actor. You touch on the relationship, that's the sort of the Civ-Mil relationship, if you like, the relationship between military actors and civilian ones, and there is a real opportunity to draw together there, if nothing else, in terms of starting to fuse our sort of what I might describe as our intelligence picture, but our understanding and our information, to bring it all together in a way that we've got some good examples, both in European waters and globally, that have been used, for instance, in counter-piracy operations and other areas, where we start to bring a much broader range of actors together, not just the classic military one. Two other sort of observations on it for me. The first is you touched on exercising and mentioned particularly Baltic Protector as an example, but I think one area where I can see this becoming a more prevalent in our collective thinking is through exercise activity, both because it's a necessary builder of our capacity and capability to act, but also as an opportunity for us to test our own doctrinal thinking and our own perspectives on some of the challenges we might face. So there's a good indicator, I think, of the growing importance of the subject. That's sort of it's featuring more in the exercise program. And then lastly, and this inevitably is a little bit longer term thinking, but is squarely closer to sort of my current role, is to start to think in military capability terms. What capabilities do we think we need in order to be able to get after some of the actions that both Dr. John and I touched on? So that it improved detection, but then also the ability to act, or at least to use the potential for action as a deterrence. I definitely see some progress in this, but as I alluded to earlier, I think we're starting from quite a long way behind for various reasons. But it's definitely the forefront, or if not at the forefront, at least within our span of interest in the UK, in NATO, including the US. And you can see quite a lot of careful thought going into how do we counter some of this action? How do we build a better understanding of what potential hostile actors might be up to, such that we can take the actions that John alluded to and others besides. So there's some observations, perhaps, rather than a neat answer to your question, but hopefully helpful.
No, absolutely. And there are actually a few things there I think we want to touch on again. But of course, one of the things you mentioned there, which is key, and you said this during your contribution as well, exploring potential, civilian military areas of partnership for addressing this issue. I was struck very much, and we did this event, of course, Andy, you were there for it as well, last year as part of the first Sea Lords Sea Power Conference here in Cambridge. And I was very struck by what your colleague, Captain Brian Trim, said at the time. I think he put in a very evocative way by saying we can't, of course, station a naval vessel at every sort of critical point. So we have to think of other ways to go about beefing up security of this type of infrastructure, again, to the extent that is in fact possible, and involving the private sector, as we, I think, discussed then, was also, of course, one of the ways in which we might be able to do that. There's actually a question that's come in, and it says, so France, for example, has a contract with ASN that guarantees it use of 9 submarine cable repair ships. And the questioner points out that there are currently only 4 cable repair ships registered in the UK, as far as they're aware. So the query here is, I guess, how should the UK better, its relationship with the private sector here in order, well, as far as the questioner is concerned, to guarantee access to these repair ships. But of course, then more broadly, going to that bigger question of addressing this larger issue. And again, Andy, I know you have a lot to say on this front, so I'll definitely go to you for. But John, what would be your response here first?
Well, the ownership of the cables is actually very complex, and in some cases you're dealing with large consortia. However, they do come to our property, so we can actually intervene to some extent. And the kind of interventions that we can offer, it's both carrot and stick. One of the things that you can say is, very well, if you're prepared to assist us with the security of these facilities, which are essential to us, we will offer you some tax incentives to do that. So if you're talking about new cables with new capability, detection capability, that's very valuable. Cable diversification, cable redundancy, we've got additional bandwidth capacity. And also, of course, a redesign of the extant and future shore stations so that we can actually protect them. It will not happen overnight, but we do need to be, shall we say, forthright in ensuring that the companies provide adequate protection of their own property. And ultimately, if they really don't want to assist, then there is the stick, which is to say, well, for this facility, we can nationalize it if we choose. Not a full nationalization, of course, but simply saying that the government from henceforth will have a golden share. We will sit on your board, and if you do something which we think compromises national security, we will overrule you.
Interesting, thank you. Andy, would you like to add to that?
Thanks. I can't speak with any authority on cable repair ships, so I'll bravely skip around that particular topic. But if we broaden that sort of question out, as you suggested, that sense of how do we build resilience into broadly our national security through relationships between private and public sector. I think that is absolutely a topic that we're seeing increased focus on in a range of scenarios and topics. One hesitates to keep lurching back to lessons from Ukraine, but I think that sense of how do you build national resilience and the experiences that we've seen from Ukraine does absolutely filter into our own thinking, both in sort of defence and wider government in the UK at the moment, and that is driving some genuinely innovative thinking about how can you solve gaps or create capacity or pace behind whatever you might have to do at perhaps at relatively short notice, in a scenario where retaining all that capability within the military, just in case, is not feasible and frankly not cost effective. So there are genuinely some interesting dialogues on a number of topics on that front going on, and I think we'll start to hear and see more of it. Obviously there are a lot of scenarios to play out there potentially, and I think we need to be realistic about where we place our limited resource. But I mean, the general point I think is that it is definitely a topic that is problematic. In part, looking at how some other European nations tackle these very similar problems, particularly in Scandinavia, but elsewhere, and not mirroring that, but at least bringing some of that thinking into UK defence as well.
Fantastic, thank you. We have a follow-up here from our first questioner, Liberty Hunter, who says, given the UK's individual geographic vulnerabilities with regard to critical national infrastructure, should we be making an effort to rewrite some of the legislation that moves the threshold of war to include attacks on critical national infrastructure? For example, citing NATO's Article 5, which is one of the points I was going to try to sneak in later on in this discussion. So thank you very much for that question. John, given that you mentioned some of these aspects earlier in contribution, would you like to take a first stab at this?
Yeah, and I think if I may pick up on your point about the JEF, because the interesting point about the JEF was it attempts to defeat the Russian expectation it would take NATO a long time to move, so it moves quickly. It can move at a sub-Article 5. We need the law that can protect the cable system. So currently, if you look at what the options are, they are very limited. We can't have new law. That's unrealistic. So don't expect to see a unified United Nations resolution on this subject. Don't expect to see the law of the sea rewritten. You're going to have to use the law as it is. You're going to have to interpret it. And I have already pointed to Truman's declaration in 1945 and how that changed the law. And I may point also to Iceland's behavior in enlarging its fishing zones. And although it cost them a great deal in terms of conflict, ultimately it led the way to a major change in the law of the sea. And I think that that is the requirement that we have. In terms of the Article 5, I think the measures that I have already spoken about, that is to say the interpretation of Article 51, and how you defend yourself. In other words, you would recognize that damage to this kind of critical infrastructure, although there have been arguments from lawyers that it didn't constitute an armed attack, it is an infringement of sovereignty. And it undermines the elementary principles on which the United Nations operates. And therefore, action against it is defensible. I don't think we need to rewrite the Atlantic Charter, but I do think we need to make a clear declaration to all of our colleagues, and in particular our enemies, or our potential enemies, that this is how we're going to interpret the law in the future. And if that leads in due course to a new set of treaty law, then so be it. I think that could be helpful.
No, I'm sorry. I think also, during your initial contribution, your citing of Article 51, I think was again very interesting. Andy, before I kind of follow up on that, is there anything that you'd like to add to that as well?
So the only thing I might add to that is it might be tempting to view this as a if this is a grey zone problem, let's remove the grey and make it black and white, and that solves the problem. I'm not sure it does. Helpful though it might be, and why don't I think it solves the problem? It is because of that. I'll go back to my earlier comments about the ease with which one can create a obscure, deniable, unattributable action, and if you're not sure who you're attributing the action to, it makes it even if the law is very clear, or the NATO article is very clear, it's inevitably going to limit how you respond. So I think it might be a necessary step to make some changes here, and I think John's absolutely right to sound a note of caution about the ease with which things can be changed in this area, but I'm not sure it's sufficient in its own right.
Right. On that, you mentioned, Andy, in your opening. So this, framing it as, this idea that it's easy to, when you're underwater, it's easier to hide. What is you're trying to do.
Yeah.
To what extent can we actually make it less easy potentially of time? Is that even possible? Of course, with the technologies that we have today, et cetera. There's always going to be a certain level, one fears, of people being able to hide, and indeed actors, whether they be state or non-state actors, being able to hide out at sea underwater. But again, to what extent can we ameliorate that? To what extent can we perhaps? I'm just thinking, because of course with the incident that I mentioned in my introduction, talking about the Eagle S. Of course, the Finns were watching it. It was in Finnish waters, which of course made it easier for the Finns to take action there. But as both of you discussed previously, of course, there is so much gray, not just in terms of these types of gray zone attacks, but also gray areas where vessels can claim, in the case, for example, of the new polar bear, an anchor issue. And then that line between accident and sabotage, right, is definitionally gray there. So I guess the question is, how can we make it less easy tied, bearing in mind that there will always be on some level some gray area in terms of that boundary between intentional and unintentional, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of played back some of the challenges that I observed in my opening comments, and I think we can make a bit of a shift here, and I'll give a couple of areas where we can. I think that idea of being able to, first of all, be able to hide in the underwater space is absolutely still valid for me. But also that being able to make a clear distinction between accident, unfortunate, inevitable defect on a pipeline or a cable. These things happen, and deliberate action it is also a little bit obscure at times, and that also plays out to that sort of the grey zone problem that we alluded to. In terms of can we do something to improve our ability to understand what's going on? Absolutely, we can. I'll give you a couple of areas. Can we do more in terms of our building a clear understanding of activity that's going on under the water, beyond the sort of classic anti-submarine warfare type view? Absolutely, we can. That inevitably requires systems to be able to do that, but they're absolutely feasible. And perhaps most importantly, and I think this is an area where we're already seeing some useful movement, is be able to join that data up, be able to build a much clearer picture of activity that's going on, patterns of activity, and how we get after it. So there are a couple of areas there. I think we're also starting to see an increased focus on how Western nations can also act submersibles and uncrewed type systems underwater beyond what one might describe as more classic roles, mine countermeasures, and that sort of thing, which have quite often used these similar capabilities in the past. So there are a number of areas where one can make capability choices to get after some of the problems. As ever, there's a trade-off here, and investment needed. And I might just go back to my earlier comments about the pace at which, or the effort at which one looks at the Russians have placed a lot of time, effort, and money over a number of years in this area. And I think that plays out to the some of the natural challenges here. You operate particularly off the continental shelf in really deep water. But even on the continental shelf, closer to the land masses, operating underwater, being able to take action, requires a set of capabilities and know-how, which does take some real effort to build up. We, as I say, we've got a little bit of catching up to do, I think, building on the things that we already do really well. So we're not starting from a standing start by any stretch, but I think the focus, attention, and ultimately the investment in these capabilities, and we know where we want to go with it, but it is a necessary step to take us forward.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. John, I want to go to you. I'm also mindful of your time that you have to dash soon, John. So let me just very quickly bring in the last question. Actually, there've just been two questions that came in. John, is it a hard at 6:30? Do you have to go then?
I can answer one more question.
Okay, fantastic. So if I then let's do this. I will see which of the two here. Right. So interesting. So okay. So I'll put this question to you then, John. This is one that just came in. Current perceptions of communication technology in the UK. They mentioned that we rely on satellites, and this person is wondering if either of you think that better public understanding of our infrastructure can help citizens put pressure on the government to take more meaningful actions in this area. And Right. So they mentioned, for example, whether that be, expanding fishing zones. They mentioned clarifying the laws of the law of the sea. Um, and yes, and then yes, and then they mentioned the earlier kind of discussion on civil military relationships. So I guess let me see if I can kind of put that more simply for you both. Okay, so I guess on the one hand, so public understanding, if we can actually raise awareness about this issue and whether that could actually help to spur further action here, which of course, we're having this sometimes very technical discussion about how do we protect, certain specific pipelines, telecommunications cables that can all get very complicated very quickly. So is there a way to, I guess, make it more understandable for people and whether raising awareness in that sphere would be helpful? And then finally, sorry, separate question, John, I know you have to go soon. This other person says that one approach, in their view, would be to build so much redundancy that that our critical national infrastructure cannot be significantly disrupted, at least. And another here, I guess, would be, they say, to build a level of defense that makes it difficult to disrupt our CNI. And the question there is, which would either of you tend towards, or is there another course of action that you would suggest? And I guess personally, from my view, I'm just thinking of the example of those islands, those Taiwanese islands right off the coast of China. I think there were two cables linking them, and both of them were severed. So I think even if you built, a number of other ones, would that in fact actually resolve the situation? So again, there's a lot there. Choose which you want to tackle. And John, I know then you have to dash. So perhaps I will let you answer this first, John, and then we can go to Andy afterwards.
Okay. Well, I'll deal with the public understanding issue first. The best way to deal with this, my recommendation is to have a popular drama, such as we had with the post office scandal, with a talented actor in a situation in which the cables are all cut. And then just look at how the government would deal with it. That I think would raise public awareness better than trying to use any kind of public education system. For the second, in terms of dealing with redundancy or dealing with resilience in the system, remember what I said earlier about the data packet management system. The government must have a system available to prioritize particular data packets, to ensure that of the available bandwidth, those have priority. Now, there are two limitations or two endpoints, the minima, if you like, or in terms of bandwidth, that you absolutely must have. The first is sufficient bandwidth to prosecute a war. The second is the sufficient bandwidth you require to prevent a shortage of foodstuffs to the public. In other words, the public may or may not be aware that politicians seem to think that after 3 days without food, there would be anarchy. So that would, the amount of bandwidth it takes to keep Tesco going, if you like, that would be a critical minimum. The resilience that you require, in addition to managing the data packets, line redundancy, but these things are very expensive. So therefore, it's not going to be a popular option. Definitely the capacity to use other systems in extremis, but bear in mind that communication systems other than fiber optic cables have a very low data rate, potentially. We can't go back to HF or reflecting system with reflecting energy off the moon, the things that we used to use, not simply. So we are going to have to look at the cable redundancy we've got. We are going to have to make economic concessions, I suspect, to companies in order to keep that. And above all else, we're going to have to protect the landing stations. And with that comment, I will thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you very much, John. Take care. Enjoy the evening. Right, Andy, I'm afraid I can't let you go quite yet.
Do you want me to tackle those
Yes,
questions?
Please do, yes.
Yeah. So on the public awareness one, I'm inclined to agree. I spoke a little bit about the importance of, the first step is recognizing there's a real problem. that is both within those communities of interest who really need to worry about these things, whether that's in governments, in the firms affected. But also that the helpful stimulus that comes from public awareness and the sort of public narrative. I think there is a point there. Certainly in the UK, I think we've seen some of that around energy security in recent years, and the sense of dependence on energy from from the continent. I don't sense, and this is just a sort of personal observation, but I don't sense that in quite the same way on the sort of telecommunications front that much of our conversation has been focused on. But yeah, as ever, in general, raising a topic in the public consciousness is probably a helpful thing to stimulate some change. I quite like the idea of a drama on television. That's certainly one way of tackling the problem. On the question of where to put your eggs, resilience or elsewhere. I mean, this is a tricky one, and I think there is always a debate about where the priorities lie in terms of making these sorts of decisions. I think my starting point on this is to observe that in general, you can either be efficient or resilient, but it's very difficult to be both. So if you're driving towards a resilience, redundancy type model to solve some of the vulnerabilities, you think that is inevitably going to cost in financial terms, but in other terms as well. So there's a balance to be struck there, and certainly focusing where you do need to build in resilience to the infrastructure, which is a debate that's happening. I think, in my observation, more on the land-based CNI than underwater, but certainly a debate that's live. Can only go so far. I think the appetite for investing will inevitably be limited. Can you solve it solely with a sort of deterrence model? Again, probably there is a limit to that in terms of where you invest your hard-earned cash in order to create the capacity to achieve much improved deterrence. It's slightly inevitably the answer is inevitably somewhere between the two extremes, I suspect.
Great. Well, excellent. I mean, that was exceptionally comprehensive, I think, as a discussion. Just to sum up, Andy, I think, you gave us a really good framework, recognizing the problem, noting that we have some catching up to do here, investing, of course, in our capabilities, in particular, the need to deter, detect, and counter the threats as they rise, the importance of working as a collective, as you said before, multinational problems like these call for multinational solutions, and of course, starting to shift the dialogue so we understand undersea CNI and approach it in the same way that we do in some ways here with land-based CNI. So hopefully I summed that up all right. This was again a very interesting and thoughtful and indeed important discussion. I'm really grateful both to you and of course to John, who unfortunately has had to dash, for joining us for this. You're again always welcome here, and I believe I will actually be seeing you later this month as well. So I will let you go. Enjoy your evening. Thank you to all those who tuned in. We had some really fantastic questions, so we really appreciate those as well. And stay tuned, and everyone is welcome to join for our future lineup of events, which we do with great regularity. So again, thank you very much again. Greetings from Cambridge, and enjoy the evening. Bye.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.